Okay, I can see from your wrinkly faces that there are not many of you who are around in 1984, or that were not reading newspapers and imbibing media in 1984. But I'm going to go back to 1984 to warm to my theme. And my theme is about what is called radical flanks, sometimes called violent flanks, as they relate to civil resistance movements. And what we're talking about situations in which a violent movement, a movement making use of organized political violence to achieve an outcome, is working in some sort of parallel or at the same time as a civil resistance movement. And what we're concerned about is how these two kinds of movement can interact and with what effect on each other in the course of doing so. Now, I'm not going to pretend to give you a lengthy or any kind of really thorough treatise on how this occurs, but what I am going to do is spend most of my time in this session talking about a particular instance where you had a civil resistance movement operating in parallel with a violent flank or a radical flank, and that is the case of South Africa, because I think it's a highly instructive example of what the mutual effect can be. And the good guys, like Umkhuseli at the back there, win in the end as well. So the men in the white hat, or the black hat, or whatever it is appropriate in this case, win in this instance. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about an example of the radical flank effect in the main, and I'll try to situate it along the way in the broader context that has been developed by people like Erika Kirchhoff and Maria Stefan. So we go to 1984. Well, in 1984, I can tell you straight away, Michael Jackson was burnt in an ad he was recording for Pepsi. I can also tell you that the first Mac desktop, Apple Mac desktop, went on sale in the United States. Okay? And I'm going to deal with less important developments than that in 1984. Okay. And we will go to Southern Africa to do so. Now, I draw your attention first of all to the map. That, of course, is Southern Africa. And this is Southern Africa in 1984. The green bit is South Africa, and you can see the two little yellow dots within its borders, Lesotho and Swaziland. Swaziland is important to our story. And you'll see two huge arrows. The arrow starts in Angola, which had got its independence about 10 years earlier from Portugal, and was a steadfast ally of the ANC at this point in 1984. And Angola was the location of the main ANC training camps for military purposes. And people from the ANC military wing would by and large fly across from Angola, across Zimbabwe, which had got its independence only 4 years earlier, to Mozambique, which, like Angola, had got its independence in about 1974, or shortly after, about 10 years earlier from the period in which we're now interested. Namibia, the brown country in the west of the continent there, has still to get its independence. Botswana had its independence, Zimbabwe had its, Zambia had its. So we're still looking at a Southern Africa locked-in conflict at this point, and the main ANC infiltration route for its guerrillas is from the training camps in Angola, flown into Mozambique, and then infiltrated into South Africa through Swaziland. Not directly across the border from Mozambique into South Africa, although that border was a lot bigger than Swaziland's border with South Africa. Question why? Reason, because the ANC had to maintain the fiction that somehow Mozambique, which was its major ally, was not actually allowing an ANC presence in Mozambique, which everybody knew was complete nonsense, but it was a fiction that had to be maintained. Now, Mozambique is interesting in 1984 because, as Umkhuseli said yesterday, in 1984, Mozambique decides to sign a security agreement with the apartheid regime in South Africa called the Nkamati Accord, in terms of which it's decided that it was going to disallow further ANC infiltration or passage through Mozambican territory into South Africa for ANC guerrillas. And in a long weekend in March of that year, a couple of days after that accord was signed, I received a message from this man, the man at the top there, giving the salute, a man called Chris Hani, who was the chief of staff at that time of the ANC guerrilla wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, that I had to go to Swaziland, be on a certain street corner at a certain time, and I would be met. At the time, I was working inside South Africa in the ANC domestic underground, doing intelligence work for ANC civilian intelligence. And I got this message, and Chris Hani was the big boss. So I duly went to Swaziland, waited on the said street corner at the said hour, the pitch dark, and sure enough, a car at the appointed time came and picked me up. And in the passenger seat of the car was the rather plump-looking man at the bottom there. I'll show you a better picture of him in a moment, called Ronnie Kasrils, and he was head of ANC military intelligence. And I was then taken off for a meeting which went on for the entire weekend in a little hut rather like that, outside a city called Manzini, with two men. One is, there's a better picture of Ronnie Kasrils. You see, he makes James Bond look like a limp-wristed liberal. The chap at the top there, Beefcake Kasrils, he was known as. And then another guy called Ivan Pillay at the bottom there, a South African of Indian origin, and without doubt, the bravest man I ever worked with. So we had a meeting for a weekend, in the course of which we went through a whole lot of my operational situation, what my situation was, what I was doing, and then they were going to give me some new tasks to do. And it was quite intense, as you can imagine. Given the reverse that had just been suffered on the Nkomati Accord, everything seemed dreadfully serious. I was beginning to feel, as one tends to do as a 30-year-old man, still with raging hormones, I was beginning to feel quite self-important. And indeed, Ronnie Kasrils and Ivan Pillay were encouraging me to feel self-important because they wanted me to do certain things. And as on the Sunday evening, I think it may have been the Monday, because I think, if I remember correctly, it was a long weekend, we'd been going at this now for about 3 or 4 days, and we were completely exhausted, as one tends to do when you're sitting in a hut like that without the usual conveniences. Ronnie Kasrils, who's quite the most hairy man I've ever come across, I used to call him King Kong, was nearly sweating himself to a whatever one sweats oneself to. And Ronnie was shaking. He needed a drink by this stage. And it was beginning to get dark. Sun was going down. And now I know that some of you come from places where you think you have beautiful sunsets, but actually, I'm afraid African sunsets, you can't beat them. It was beautiful orange, turning to red. The sun was going to go down. I was about to go across the border. I was waiting for it to get dark. And Ronnie was giving me my final speech, this final send-off speech. And I won't, I know you're all grown up, but I won't give you some of the obscenities he used to describe what we were going to do to the enemy. But there was a lot of this kind of stuff going on. And he was giving me statements like, Howard, you're going to be marching down, comrade, he was going, you're going to be marching down Church Street, which is the main street in the capital, in military fatigues, booted. Moi? You know, quite surprised. But yes, that was my future that had been mapped out for me. And in the midst of this incredible send-off that I was being given, with the blood-red sun going down, the carcass of the day spread across the horizon, this came through the window. And we both fled out of the hut. It's a bat. I subsequently wrote a little short book on the ANC's armed struggle, which is dedicated to Ronnie Kasrils, who thought nothing of taking on the apartheid state, I say, but couldn't kill a Swazi bat. Okay. Anyway, Ronnie and I were sort of standing outside this hut, shaking. Ivan Pillay, the other guy, the brave guy, he came running out to see what was going on. He thought the enemy had arrived or whatever. And he said, "What's the matter?" We said, "There's a bat inside." Anyway, so he eventually went in with a newspaper and a broom. He beat the poor bat to death, brought it out, showed it to us. We sort of recoiled like that. And then I went back over the border to fearlessly take forward the Mkhonto Wisizwe, which means the spear of the nation in Zulu, the name of the military wing, to take forward, to take the battle to the enemy. I'd been given some new tasks, which I'll return to at the end of this talk. That was my introduction to the military struggle. It was not one that imbued me with great confidence. And that inclination on my part was to prove justified, I'm afraid. Now, as I've said, at this time, the armed struggle was running in parallel to a civil resistance campaign, which I'll come to the development of in a moment. But just so that we can put ourselves where we need to be in considering what we're trying to deal with in this particular presentation, let me just go through again some of the figures that Erika alluded to earlier from her, Kurt Schock, and Maria Stefan's work. And that is that they surveyed 233 insurrections over a period of about 100 years, of which 106 involved civil resistance and 48 of them involved simultaneous armed and civil resistance campaigns running together. And they found, as you already know, I'm sure, but let us remind ourselves, that the nonviolent civil resistance campaigns were more than twice as likely to succeed as violent resistance campaigns. Moreover, they found that when civil resistance and violence were deployed in the same struggle, the violent campaign had no positive effect. The violence had no positive effect on the attempt of people to organize effective civil resistance. So there was no positive effect from a radical or a violent flank. It didn't help the nonviolent struggle. Instead, there was a minuscule negative effect, not statistically significant, but nonetheless a negative effect. So simultaneous violence had a negative effect on civil resistance, although not statistically significant. But perhaps the most significant of the findings, to my mind anyway, is the suggestion that the power of a nonviolent resistance struggle lies in its ability to mobilize widespread, diverse, popular support. Whereas, in fact, in the case of a military struggle, what happens is that you have a polarization, but perhaps more important here is that it tends to take the struggle away from ordinary people and beyond the participation of ordinary people. That the elements of participation, the influence of the form of struggle on the degree of public participation, of actual active involvement that it can involve, is the important factor here. And as will become evident in the case of the ANC, its armed struggle was really a sideshow perpetually, which never managed to engage people on any sort of mass scale, despite continuous and chronic attempts to get it to do so. Now, the fact that the ANC was involved in an armed struggle is something that went against some 48-odd years of tradition in the ANC. Because if we look at the history of nonviolence, and many of you will know, many of the principles of nonviolent struggle, of civil resistance, were actually established in South Africa when Mohandas Gandhi was there as a young lawyer in the early days of the 20th century. And that Gandhian tradition had tremendous effects on what was termed the Natal Indian Congress. Natal is an area of South Africa, and there was an Indian population, in the sense of Indians from India, who had been transported out to South Africa as indentured laborers as a form of slavery to work in sugarcane fields in the Natal area, which is up the east coast of South Africa. And these Indian people were living in appalling conditions, political, social conditions, as well as physical living conditions. And Gandhi played an important role in mobilizing them around in a non-violent manner in the Natal Indian Congress, as it was called. And this Natal Indian Congress became, in subsequent years, and its larger national organization, the South African Indian Congress, became an important intellectual influence on the form that the struggle against apartheid took for the first half, at least the first half, of the 20th century. The ANC, which was formed in 1912, had initially, in its early days, as Kasrils said last night, a really rather sedate and sedentary approach to politics. It used to involve itself in petitions and the odd kind of delegation to Parliament to appeal to the nicer white chaps not to be nasty to the nicer black chaps, and to let the nicer black chaps have a few privileges. But the ANC at that stage didn't have or pretend to have any real mass base at all. The development of a mass-based ANC, if one can call it that, only comes after World War II, when you get the arrival, among other things, there's a big change in social conditions over the course of World War II inside South Africa. But what happens as well is the arrival of a young group of militants around Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, he became his partner-in-law, their patron, a man called Walter Sisulu, a man of humble origins, but a man of sort of an organic sort of intellectual in black life, and there were others as well. And these young men decided, there were also some women who were very militant as well, I shouldn't forget that. There's the Federation of South African Women and the ANC Women's League, who themselves became very important parts of this militantization, if I may call that, this radicalization of the ANC, not in the violent sense, but in terms of its political program and its composition. And they developed certain campaigns to begin to realize their wish for a mass base in the ANC. They started a campaign for the defiance of unjust laws, and as Kasrils was pointing out last night, all black men at that time had to travel continually with what you could call an internal passport, a thing called a dom pass, which means a stupid pass. They had to use this thing all the time and have it in order. It decided where they could legally live and work, and not to have it meant, in all probability, to go to jail or to pay a hefty fine. The defiance campaign was a defiance of laws of this kind, and considerable public participation, particularly among black people, but also among allied organizations like the Indian Congresses, a few white communists, militant Christians, and militant liberals, and people in the so-called mixed race or colored community were also involved, some of the allies, in backing the ANC, which was an black African organization, in this defiance campaign. At the same time, the ANC wanted, as all serious movements tend to, not just to say what it was fighting against, but to say what it was fighting for. What was its vision? And with that in mind, it set about trying to canvass among the broad mass of people for their points of view on what a future South Africa, a post-apartheid South Africa, might look like or should look like. And this became a campaign. It became what is called the Freedom Charter campaign. It was a campaign to draw up a charter laying out the vision for a future South Africa. Many, many people were involved in collecting ideas from many, many different parts of the country, and these different ideas were consolidated in a document which was eventually formulated by a man with a rather poetic turn of phrase, and out came a document called the Freedom Charter. I think without doubt one of the most eloquent statements of a people's wish to be free. Its opening is, we declare for our people in the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. That's its opening. Beautiful opening. it's not so much a program as what you could call a lodestar, a guiding star, a guiding light, a vision. But it set out and provided an ethos as well as a set of constituent parts of a vision of a future South Africa. As a result of that, a number of people, among them Mandela, hundreds of others, were detained, put on trial in a long trial that went on for 4 or 5 years called the treason trial, and in an attempt, among other things, to take them out of action. What I'm trying to describe here is a process in which the ANC was no longer a sedentary organization, it was now a fighting organization in the sense of being a civil resistance fighting organization. And in the course of these various campaigns, a rival organization which had developed called the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was more Africanist in its approach than the ANC. The ANC tended to stress interracial solidarity among Democrats of all colors. The PAC held a demonstration against the pass laws in a township called Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg, in which more than 60 people were shot dead, black people, who'd been demonstrating peacefully against the pass laws. Most of them were shot dead in the back, which indicates the nature of the threat they constituted to the regime at the time that they were shot and the circumstances under which they were shot. Now, this Sharpeville massacre, as it became known, was a convulsion in South African politics. The pictures you can see, those are taken from Sharpeville on the left there. That's Gandhi on the top right and a young Mandela consulting with 2 of his ANC colleagues in the bottom right. Now, the nature of that convulsion was to place before the ANC in a way that's with a sharpness and a clarity that had never been present before, placed before the ANC the choice of did it continue with civil resistance or did it decide to go for armed struggle. As a result of the Sharpeville massacre and the local and international outrage that greeted it, the South African regime had declared a state of emergency and detained thousands of people, many of them being leaders of the ANC. What happened was that a group of people in the ANC, together with some people who were members of the Communist Party, decided to go for armed struggle in the name of the ANC. And precisely how that decision was taken and how it was eventually, it came to be given by default or merely by default or by actual decision, a project of the ANC as such is something that is quite heavily disputed in the history and something on which there is a disturbing lack of clarity. But anyway, the ANC decided, together with some of its allies in the Communist Party, that it was going to go for armed struggle. And in 1961, in December, Umkhonto we Sizwe, as it became known, the Spear of the Nation, announced its existence in a series of pamphlets and sabotage acts around South Africa. And the pamphlets carried a statement of intent, a manifesto, as it was called, of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which opened, if I remember correctly, with the words that there comes the time in the life of any nation when there remain only 2 choices, submit or fight. That choice has now come, that time has now come to South Africa. We will not submit, and therefore we have no choice but to fight back with all the means at our disposal, blah, blah, blah. Now, for many people, that was a dramatic and proud moment. For many people, it was an emotionally necessary moment. But the question that has, I think, in some degree haunted certainly those of us who have been willing to entertain it, and I say that because there are some people who are not prepared to entertain the question, but the question of whether or not that decision, although emotionally satisfying, whether that decision was the smart decision is a matter that has still got to really be debated among South Africans of all colours, races, and political persuasions. It was no doubt an emotionally satisfying decision. It was no doubt a dramatic decision. It was also in the sort of dominant discourses of revolution and the request for the search for radical social change at that time, an eminently respectable decision, because there were colonial wars all over the world in which people were resorting to force, and it seemed only natural that South Africans should do so themselves after something like this, the Sharpeville massacre. But I return to the question. Emotionally satisfying, it may have been; dramatic, it may have been, but was it the smart thing to do? And it's that question which now underlies the rest of this presentation. As is most common, I think, when people resort to armed struggles, unless they are crazy, they will tend in the first instance to maintain that that resort has the primary objective of defense. It is an attempt by a people to defend itself. And certainly, black people in South Africa had every right to claim that they needed to find a form of defense for themselves against this regime that they were confronting. So the initial claim was, for clear moral political reasons, that the formation of the Spear of the Nation, Umkhonto we Sizwe, was defensive in its intent. But very quickly, there were developed a set of plans for what was an offensive guerrilla campaign, and the gist of it was a Guevarist approach to armed struggle, which I will describe in a moment. Che Guevara, the chap in the fancy black beret, you know him? Looks a bit like, well, who? Anyway, the good-looking guy with the black beret, the dramatic-looking chap with the black beret. Che Guevara had written an account and was promoting an account along with an overexcitable French intellectual called Régis Debray of what had happened in Cuba. And the account that they gave of what happened in Cuba is that this group of cigar-smoking, beret-wearing, dramatically bearded men arrived in a boat that sunk off the coast, and within, whatever it was, 18 months, had overthrown the dictator Batista, who had been backed by the US government and the mafia and whatever. Now, the gist of the Guevarist approach to armed struggle is that you don't need to go in for mobilization of people by political means independent of your armed struggle. The fantasy of a Guevarist approach to armed struggle is that armed struggle alone can, so to say, spark off revolution among the mass of people. It can lead to the spontaneous organization by the masses of themselves. You do not have to engage in political organization or mobilization by political means. Armed struggle alone will achieve this for you. Now that, according to Guevara and Debray, was what had happened in the Cuban Revolution. It was not at all what happened in the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution depended quite substantially at crucial points, in fact throughout, one could argue, on a unity in action between these romantic guerrillas and the trade unions and various other groups inside the cities in and around Cuba who had been fighting for many years against the Batista regime. So the point I'm trying to make is that the ANC took a choice of a form of armed struggle which tended, and this is the crucial point here, which ruled out of the equation political organization by political means. Now this went completely contrary to everything that had gone before in the years between 1912 and 1960, from the formation of the ANC through until the moment of adoption of armed struggle. And unsurprisingly, when this decision was taken in these terms, what happened is that all the ANC and the Communist Party's most gifted organizers were taken out of political roles and put into military roles. which created a massive distortion. There were other choices available other than Guevara. There was Mao Zedong, for example, the Chinese revolutionary leader, whose approach depended on assiduous political organization by political means. Very careful and sustained political organization by political means. And there were other approaches as well. But the ANC was taken in by this Guevarist model. It would have been very difficult, it is true, for the ANC to pay any kind of homage at that time to the Chinese. The tensions were beginning to develop between China and Russia, which would, at least the Soviet Union at the time, which were to break out into all-out sort of, not quite war, but conflict within the communist community in 1965. But we hadn't got to that point yet. But it would have been still very difficult for the ANC at that time to declare that they were following a Maoist point of view. But they chose, whatever, to go for this Guevarist one, which ignored or wrote politics out of their activities. Now, this you can, as you could see from my earlier slide with the borders of South Africa, there were no contiguous borders. Certainly not Zimbabwe wasn't yet independent. Namibia wasn't independent. Countries like Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland weren't yet independent. Mozambique wasn't independent. There were no contiguous bases with no countries that were adjacent to South Africa which could be used as real bases. That being the case, any organization set on conducting an armed struggle had to develop an internal political base of some sophistication to have any hope in hell of running a successful guerrilla campaign. But the ANC had, by the method or the approach that it had chosen, this Guevarist approach, ruled out the possibility of ever developing such a base, certainly by political organization, by political means. Now, this was left the ANC in an awful mess over the next 2 to 3 years, because the South African security and intelligence services, who operationally were always very good, had basically rolled up completely rolled up the ANC and Communist Party organization by late 1965. There was nothing left. You could talk, and my doctorate is on the ANC, on operational strategy, and at that stage you could literally count on one hand, here, the fingers of one hand, how many people between about 1965 and 1968-69 were active in the ANC and Communist Party in South Africa. One hand, at any one time. The ANC and Communist Party had been smashed. Those who weren't on Robben Island or in Pretoria Central Jail outside Pretoria were in exile, or, as Mkhoseli described it last night, chup still, quiet, keeping quiet, scared, out of their wits. The ANC had been defeated and cowed at that point, and South Africans, Democrats in South Africa, had been defeated and been cowed. Some very seriously mistaken strategic decisions had been made by the ANC leadership, or by a section of it, and the South African Democrats were now paying the price. Now, in 1968-69, the ANC's answer to this crisis was now to try to return guerrillas into South Africa. And it duly did so in 2 campaigns where they came through Zambia into what was then Rhodesia. Rhodesia was then a white colony which had declared its own, unilaterally declared independence, and ruled by whites who didn't want to give over to black rule. And the ANC had joined up with one of the Zimbabwean liberation movements called ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, and they conducted a joint operation to get people through then Rhodesia, or in the case of ZAPU, to get people into Rhodesia to fight, and in the case of the ANC, to get people through Rhodesia into South Africa. In the case of it was a disaster, the 2 campaigns. One at Hwangi, which is a big national park, big game park, very good game park. If you're looking to go and watch game in Southern Africa, I recommend it. Very good.
Thank you for that.
Okay, fine, okay. And good. So the Zimbabwe Tourist Board doesn't even pay me for this, okay? And then there's Sipulilo up in the north, where they also try to infiltrate people across. Only one ANC chap got through, and he remained inactive for many years. He reminded everybody that he got through when things had more or less come to an end. Now, the second major defeat in these two campaigns prompted the ANC to hold a big conference in Tanzania in a place called Morogoro to review its strategic position and to decide on its way forward. And that's the product of that conference was a document called The Strategy and Tactics of the ANC. This was in 1969. And in that document, the ANC said that the, and I quote, only way, the only way forward was armed struggle. Okay, what we're looking at is a movement that is making very, very serious, we can say this with hindsight, strategic errors. Notwithstanding this emphasis on armed struggle, armed struggle, armed struggle, armed struggle, between 1965 and 1976, that is 11 years, there was no armed struggle of any description inside South Africa. None. People, as we said, had been largely cowed. But in the late 1960s, and Nkoseli was talking about this last night, there were two important developments. The first was the development of the black consciousness movement by a group of young black intellectuals, mainly Steve Biko and another man called Bani Pityana, two young, very, very bright intellectuals, gifted guys. And the nature of black consciousness is very relevant to the doctrines that we are examining here of civil resistance, because what black consciousness was about was, in the first place, of actually getting black people to rediscover their own pride and recover their own history and recover their own values and recover their own society and sense of themselves. But allied with that was another component which is absolutely crucial and central to our ability to understand the dynamics of civil resistance. And that was at the very heart of black consciousness was the statement that we as black people are oppressed and will remain oppressed only for as long as we allow ourselves to remain oppressed. Okay? That's the view of power. You'll remember, I had to go and have a sleep yesterday, so I don't know whether I missed something, but the idea of power that stands at the political power that stands at the very center of civil resistance is one that states that rulers rule because the ruled allow them to rule. Okay? Rulers rule because those who are ruled by them allow them to rule. And the black consciousness movement put this up front, right up front, before black people, the black majority in South Africa. We, comrades, the statement was, will remain oppressed only for as long as we allow ourselves to be oppressed by the other side. And that was a major, major shift in the discourse of opposition in South Africa. Another part of the black consciousness movement was to tell people like me, nice, limp-wristed, militant liberals, that they didn't want anything to do with us anymore. You guys we black guys have got to get on with us. We were all very hurt. But that wasn't really the point. But a number of white guys on the left came up with a very constructive response to that exclusion from solidarity work at that stage with black people. These guys, mainly young Marxists, independent Marxists, not allied to the South African Communist Party, decided, okay, well, the black intellectuals won't let us interact with them. What we're going to do is we're going to set about trying to help black people, members of the working class, try and organize themselves again into trade unions. And that's what happened. So you had a group of very gifted young white people of the left now beginning to organize people in the trade unions, black workers in the trade unions who needed representation. They were exploited horribly at this point. Now what's the point here? The point is the ANC has said it's armed struggle only. It hasn't managed to have any armed struggle inside the country by that stage it's 5 years, and it's going to be 11 or 12 years before they again get any sort of armed struggle inside the country. Because they've said political organization by political means is not just not needed, it's impossible. But here you have two groups of people independently of each other, engaging in political organization by political means. The black consciousness movement and these white intellectuals involved in organizing black workers into trade unions. You have people showing the ANC that it is possible to organize politically by political means even under the conditions of the most extreme repression. And they were banned, harassed, put in jail, held in detention for an incommunicado and indefinitely in detention for months on end, many of them. And in the case of Steve Biko and others, bombed. A guy called Abram Tiro bombed with a letter bomb, killed. Steve Biko eventually murdered in detention. It could be done. The costs were high, but the costs for armed struggle were high too. And armed struggle didn't even exist in the country at that point. The point was that the ANC had miscalculated. It was possible, and it is possible, under the conditions of the most extreme repression, to organize politically by political means. In fact, think about it. It's much easier in a situation of extreme repression to organize by political means than by military means, because you let off a bomb, everybody notices. You know, it's very difficult. You let off a bomb, you've got to run. You know, if you're going to let off a bomb, 70, 80%, well, we've got a military man here, he'll confirm it, 70, 80% of your energy is taken up with how the hell I get out on time. Eh? It's retreat. It's getting away from the point of... So the point is, if you can work politically by political means in conditions of repression, extreme repression, far more easily than you can work militarily. Far, far more easily. And the ANC didn't realize this. Okay, so... Yeah.
Я хотела выяснить, я не понимаю, откуда вот эти повстанцы, которые использовали насильственные методы, брали амуницию, оружие, кто их учил стрелять, ведь это безумно дорого.
Could I just clarify something?
Yeah.
Talking about the violent rebels, where they were getting ammunition, armament, it's a very expensive thing.
Moscow. Yeah. Russia.
From Russia with love.
Yeah. Communists.
У нас были такие проблемы с сельским хозяйством, с одеждой, с едой. И мы тратили эти деньги на оружие.
We have shortages. We didn't have clothes to wear. We didn't have food to eat, and we were spending money to support.
And we were very grateful. We were very grateful. We were very grateful. Okay. So anyway, the point is that there was space to organize by political means, and the ANC had missed it. Now, arising out of this ferment that the black conscious movement largely had caused, developed this generation of which I think Kasrils is probably an absolutely prime example of many of them very gifted, very determined, conscientized, politically astute young people. And in the case of, there's a big black township southwest of Johannesburg called Soweto with a few million people in it, a segregated township for black African people only. About 12,000 young students in June 1976 went on a march to protest against being taught their lessons in a language called Afrikaans, which many people identified at that time as the language of the oppressor. And the police opened fire on these children. They were children, 11, 12, 13 years old. Some of them 17, 18, and many were shot. The young boy that you can see there was reputedly the first person to die, a young boy called Hector Peterson. And in response, many very angry, thousands of very angry young black people left the country and sought out the ANC to receive armed struggle. Now, what is the dynamic that is happening here? People are very angry. It's an emotional political response. They've seen that they've been shot at. Some of them have been wounded. They've seen their friends killed, shot, faces blown away. And they want to hit back. Now, at that point, the ANC, which had conducted some sort of armed struggle at some time, even if that armed struggle was evident only in its failures, the ANC had still conducted some sort of armed struggle. And so they sought out the ANC in Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, etc. And thousands now went off to receive training. And they began to return from about late 1976, 77 onwards. But what happened was that at this point, although the ANC had now resumed some sort of armed struggle at a very low level of intensity, we're talking about in the first year in about 1977, if I remember correctly, the figures in my thesis show that it was about 32 acts of sabotage, and some of them were really minor. It's like blowing up an electricity pylon, which knocks the electricity out for about 6 hours. 32 acts, I think, in the first year, which is next to nothing. But ANC leaders were asking themselves the question, well, why on earth is our armed struggle not succeeding? And they began to ask themselves serious questions, and they sent a delegation to Vietnam to ask the Vietnamese. They figured, well, if anybody can tell us, it's the Vietnamese, because they've apparently just defeated a US-backed regime in the most sustained guerrilla conventional war of liberation that the world has ever seen. So they went off to Vietnam. They gave the Vietnamese a briefing. They met people like General Vo Nguyen Giap, the main theoretician of war in Vietnam, and they met with others. And they gave them a briefing, told them what they were trying to do, what level things were running at, what the situation was. The Vietnamese said, give us a little while. The Vietnamese went away that evening, came back the next morning, and said, right, well, this is what we think. Number one, you've got it all wrong. Number two, you shouldn't even be engaged in armed struggle. Three, what you've got to do is get involved in political organization by political means, and then look at armed struggle. This is from a communist perspective. This was a terrible shock for the ANC leadership, and a number of ANC leaders never accepted it even to the end. Among them, the then head of the ANC military wing, a man called Joe Medici. But what did come out of this in the ANC was that for some people in the ANC who had ears to hear and some people who had brains to use in the leadership, and that wasn't all of them, decided that they had to actually start thinking seriously now about political organization by political means. And they had before their eyes clear evidence of the black consciousness movement and the trade unions organizing on the ground and managing to organize on the ground at very significant rates of success. And they, the ANC, had completely ignored this. Now, inside the country, what was the attitude of these emergent political organizations to the ANC? Well, I can't give you, there's no homogeneous view here, but I think that what one can safely say is that the armed struggle in the ANC still had immense cachet, kind of allure, attractiveness, hey? You agree with that, hey? Yeah. Immense allure and authority, in a sense. Although it wasn't around, it had an immense kind of authority and legitimacy, which no other organization could match. But it wasn't really present. Yes, there began to emerge from after 1976 some sort of relationship between the ANC outside, the leadership outside the country, and people working, most people working semi-autonomously or autonomously altogether of the ANC inside the country in political organizations. And a very clever man at that time, I don't know what's happened to him now, he seems to have lost his brain, but Mac Maharaj, he's now President Zuma's spokesman. And that is a job from hell, I think. But anyway, Mac Maharaj was the head of ANC Reconstruction and Development and was a very inventive man at that time, very astute. And he was in charge of ANC Internal Reconstruction and Development, as it was called. And he began to establish links into or with these activists who were beginning to work autonomously. And they began to develop a basis for cooperation, a brief period of cooperation between armed struggle and political struggle. There was a period around about 1980, 1981, when the apartheid regime wanted to celebrate 20 years of the existence of this republic, this entity called the Republic of South Africa. And progressive groups around the country, black, white, decided that they were going to boycott these celebrations of this republic. And what happened is there was a period of about a year and a half where ANC's military wing, Mkhonto we says, we managed to mount a series of attacks which were clearly allied to this growing political mobilization, largely independent of it. But it never really developed into anything. What had happened in the meantime is that the nature of the political organization that was developing inside the country had broadened substantially. It was no longer a case of there being a student organization called SASA, which is the Black Consciousness, sort of the main group in the Black Consciousness movement. There wasn't just a thing called the Black Community Programs or Black People's Convention, as the main umbrella organization of Black Consciousness was called. People had, in response to the challenges, the concrete challenges that had resulted from the uprisings in Soweto and elsewhere across the country in 1976, developed community organizations in most black townships around the country. Artists had also started to form their own groups. Women had started to form their own groups. This is among the black population predominantly. So what was developing was a blossoming of a whole range of different popular organizations, all of them having at their heart basically democratic ethos, but all of them organized around a very concrete set of specific grievances or problems experienced by a particular group of people in the society, whether it was students or workers or women or poets, cultural workers, etc., or a community, a whole community itself in a township. So you had a proliferation not just of organizations, but of kinds of organizations that were developed, all sharing a democratic ethos. And what began to emerge inside the country was a realization that all these problems, a realization among people, and it wasn't difficult, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to realize this. The realization was that each of these different organizations and the particular sectional problems or grievances that it was voicing, those grievances or those problems could be answered only by an address to the issue of national state power. Important. If you have grievances, it became clear that these grievances could be only addressed by an address to the issue of national state power. And therein, in that, lay the seed of what was to be the formation 2 years after 1981, in 1983, of an umbrella organization, a national umbrella organization called the United Democratic Front, which formed an umbrella or provided a home for around a minimal program, a very modestly stated program. It allowed membership to all organizations. Organizations could affiliate to the UDF. It allowed affiliation to all organizations which shared the most basic democratic ethos and offered to bring together, to in some sense aggregate these various demands in the demand for an address to the issue of state power. Now, the immediate stimulus for the formation of the United Democratic Front was an attempt by the apartheid regime to reform itself somewhat in order to win over into some sort of alliance with the white minority population, sections of the ethnic Indian population and the mixed-race colored population. It was an attempt at a constitutional arrangement to include these two other minority groups, designated in racial terms, but to, in a sense, solidify the exclusion of the black African majority. That was the immediate stimulus. But the basic drive behind the formation of the United Democratic Front was to allow an address to the issue of state power around these various sectional grievances. Now, I think there are two important points here for civil resistance, if I might just bring them out. One is the organization of people around concrete grievances on a sectional basis. The other thing was the recognition of the need to aggregate these, to bring these together in an address to state power, and that comes from the realization that none of these sectional grievances could be met or resolved without an address to state power. The second important thing about the UDF, the United Democratic Front, was the nature of its structure. It was an umbrella organization. That meant that only organizations could join it. That meant that the UDF had different layers of leadership. It would have a central leadership. It was very small most of the time. But it had leadership of the various constituent organizations. It had different levels of leadership. It could not be, you couldn't chop off its head and hope to silence it. You couldn't hope to wipe it out. It had a very broad-based leadership. It had strong local organization, strong sectional organization. Also, a point I made earlier, the organization was taking place around concrete issues of immediate importance to people. It had a small, mobile national leadership, and it had a national political focus. Now, with the formation of the United Democratic Front, what eventually developed was, I think you can call it a rolling or perpetual phase of mass action. One minor uprising would tend to follow another. A confrontation with the regime in one particular area of the country or on one particular set of issues would roll into the next. There were demonstrations, local and general strikes, rent and service boycotts, consumer boycotts such as that led by Mkhweli, which was one of the most inventive and formative of these interventions. There were students, women's and other protests. There were mass rallies. There was leafleting, etc. And there was also, interestingly, an iconography of violence that accompanied this political organization by political means in the UDF. Now, if any of you thought that size didn't matter to South African men, just look at that size of that AK-47. Eh? That one's made out of super big pipes, that one. Eh? Okay. Anyway, that is taken from a UDF rally, United Democratic Front rally, and it's sort of like literally guerrilla theater. But it's there never was, that I'm aware of, and Mkhweli can correct me if I'm wrong, any sense of antagonism between that image and what people were doing. There was no sense of division. But deciding precisely what the meaning of that iconography was is not an easy thing to do. I've battled with it, and it's a very nice semiotic project for somebody doing a PhD, the iconography of violence in South Africa at this time. But basically, to me, the most important message in that iconography was that people who still held out the prospect or the romance of violence were saying, in a sense, that there was nothing less effective about the mass political organization by political means than armed struggle. And in fact, it was becoming increasingly clear that the mass political organization was considerably more effective than anything the armed struggle could ever hope to achieve. Now, just to come to the end of this, there was South Africa entered a phase from about 1984, 1985 onwards, entered a phase of perpetual crisis and worsening crisis, which exacted immense costs. And this is another point here that we need to, from the point of view of the theory of nonviolent, strategic nonviolence and civil resistance, to drive home. The forms of organization developed in the United Democratic Front, the mass organizations and their confrontations with the government imposed and exacted immense costs on the regime, immense costs. And it had various follow-on effects, such as immense diplomatic costs on the regime, immense economic costs in the form of disinvestment, etc. And as the situation worsened for the regime, various recalculations started taking place. Even among the most resolutely militarist of the ANC leaders, there began to dawn an understanding that the armed struggle was doing almost nothing. They couldn't admit to it publicly because that would mean undermining their own ambitions and position. But it was quite clear to anybody with a brain to see and an ear to hear that was the case. Within the South African intelligence services, can I just hold on one second? Yes. Yeah,
yeah. Sorry, but then if that is the case, why did the apartheid regime make it such a point to try and get Mandela in prison, to disassociate himself with the armed struggle if it was ineffective?
To divide the ANC. It would have blasted the ANC to pieces if he'd done that. The ANC outside would have been a laughing stock. if Mandela had ever said that, if he believed it, which I don't know that he did. I don't know. I mean, I'm not privileged to.
He wouldn't have really known.
No, but he wouldn't have.
Outside.
Well, no, he was pretty well informed, I can assure you. He was pretty well informed, and particularly in those final years, he was extremely well informed, in fact.
More informed about the mass resistance than
Probably yes, but I can't say that with confidence. I mean, he knew what the mass resistance was achieving, I'm sure. But Mkhoseli would know that better than I do. Eh? How well informed was the old man?
No, he was well informed.
Yeah.
He quickly saw the benefit of the mass mobilization, and that is why we're called in. It was unprecedented in South African political landscape that we could have prisoners. We were in our own prison.
Yeah.
Invited to visit Mandela in his own prison. By South African standard at the time, it was treason of the highest order within the liberation structure.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was because of his recognition.
Yeah. Now, there were various recalculations that took place at this point. Remember now that also the Soviet Union is beginning to fall apart, and that becomes a very important factor in all this as well. It is an external dynamic which removes from the South African regime one of its the main slogans under which it has sought to organize Western protection for itself. Okay, so the collapse of the Soviet Union at this time becomes very, very important. But what independent of that as well, there is also taking place in the South African security and intelligence apparatus, and I got to know some of these chaps when I got back from exile, a recalculation of their abilities and their interests. And they began to come to the conclusion from about 1985 onwards that this was an uncontrollable situation and that there had to be an accommodation that went well beyond merely the requirements of what you call it, a counterinsurgency maneuver. There had to be very, very serious reform of the entire apartheid structure, if not its complete dismantling. They didn't come to that conclusion with any joy in their hearts, but they came to that conclusion as a result of hard-headed analysis. At the same time, as I say, among some ANC leaders, they began to dawn the notion that actually what with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the manifest failure of the armed struggle thus far, there was no prospect of coming to any sort of armed conclusion of the South African regime, whatever fantasies they'd entertained over the previous 30 years that there might be some sort of armed revolutionary outcome in South Africa. And so this fundamental reassessment of these various positions led people to an accommodation, which those of you who've been reading your civil resistance theory will know is a situation in which neither side feels able to defeat the other, but they feel able to come to some sort of agreement with which both can live. They don't like the idea of reaching an accommodation with the enemy, but it's an accommodation that they believe they can live with. And as a result of this, well, it has the unbanning of the ANC in 1990 and the violent progress to eventually a successful negotiated outcome in the nature, again, of an accommodation. Now, I want to draw out 4 points and then just end with a little brief story. There are 4 points that I think are the take-home points, as they seem to be called, out of this lecture. The ANC's obsession with armed struggle from the 1960s to 1979 undermined two things. One was its ability to engage in civil resistance. It took all its most gifted organizers out of civil resistance. It missed the boat on civil resistance. But at the same time, the ANC's disregard for political organization by political means paradoxically also undermined its ability to mount an armed struggle. It never could create for itself the kind of political base on which to mount an armed struggle. Secondly, and this is perhaps the most important point, civil resistance in South Africa coexisted with the armed struggle and very, very quickly, once it took root, displaced and supplanted the armed struggle as the main form of struggle in South Africa. The people who wanted the armed struggle had envisaged the mass mobilization of people merely as a tributary, something to help them conduct an armed struggle. But in fact, that political mobilization completely trumped the armed struggle. The iconography of violence that occurred in South Africa between 1983 and 1989 helped paradoxically advance the struggle being waged by nonviolent means, because it in a sense conveyed this odd paradoxical message that there was nothing to choose in terms of revolutionary legitimacy between the political struggle by political means and armed struggle. And fourthly, if one can say that there was any strategic result of the ANC's armed struggle, it was a very limited one. And it was limited in this sense, that it indicated that the ANC had, far more so than any other organization from the 1950s and 1960s, the will to struggle against a manifestly brutal and unjust opponent. And what it also shows is that this story that I told shows is that an organization like the ANC, or an organization, can win power if it commands legitimacy in a situation, in a revolutionary situation. An organization can sometimes win power on the back of the energies of others in which it had almost no role in generating. Now let's go back to my first meeting in the Swaziland hut. I was given certain tasks, and I went off and did them in my dutiful way, in my overly dutiful way. And one of them was to visit some areas in KwaZulu-Natal and to very thoroughly do reconnaissance work on them. The reason was that there were some nasty white farmers in the area, and the ANC was planning to knock them out. So my job was to find out where the roads ran, where the spots were, where the caves were, whether this were, whether that weren't, where the police station was in relation to this, that, and the other thing. And I did this, and I wrote a 60-page report. Ordnance, maps, the whole kerfuffle. And, but I had to send this out of the country. Okay, now at the time I was married to a fantastic woman who made Catherine Deneuve look like a frump. And when it came to political judgment, you could say she made Joe Stalin look like a marshmallow. Okay? Anyway, she and I were a devastating team, and I had to set about coding this bloody 60-page document. Now, I was using a thing called an old book code, which is where each letter you say page. The person outside has exactly the same edition of the book that you've got, that you're using to code. And you have to say for each letter, page 16, line such and such, word such and such, letter such and such, okay? So it's a hell of a business. I mean, you go mad after an hour. And I spent about 3 weeks doing this thing, but I never got I didn't code everything, but I had to code everything which might give away the position that I was talking about. Then we reduced it to a photograph, and then we, as we used to do, sliced it up and put these negative in this birthday card, which is sliced with a blade, so it was in and all neatly sealed up. And then you had to send this birthday card, but you had to go to all different parts of Johannesburg and the Transvaal, as the province was known, to send these birthday cards all to this little boy called, Nkosi so-and-so, whatever, who lived in Swaziland. And and you'd have to have different shaped envelopes, different handwriting, different colored pens, so all you were trying to do is to smuggle this report out as one of several birthday cards to a non-existent little boy at a postal box address in Swaziland. So the time we've posted all the other letters and cards, but the time comes now to post the main thing, the one with the report in. So we go on this long thing called a check route, which is a counter-surveillance route where you go. It takes about 2 or 3 hours if you do it properly, trying to work out that you're not being followed. You go by car, then you go by walk, and then you go by foot, and then you do this, and then you do that, and you go into a bookshop, and you look in the mirrors and backwards, blah, 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 etc. And by the end of it, if you weren't a wreck already from 3 weeks of trying to code a 60-page document, by the end of this thing, one was a wreck. One was a wreck, I was a wreck. So Jenny and I, the last bit of the thing is get in the car, drive to the post office to post this thing. Jenny stays in the car, I jump out of the car, I go across the road, there's the post box, I put it in, and I walk back to the car thinking, oh God, thank God, it's finished, it's gone. And I can see Jenny looking at me with utter horror on her face. Complete horror. And I think, who's behind me? What's going to happen now? And I get into the car, and I dare not look behind me. And she's just completely... And I said, well, what's the matter? She says, you didn't put a stamp on it. So anyway, what did we do? She went off. She was so irritated. She couldn't stay. She went off. I stayed there and waited for the man who came along to empty the postbox. And I said, oh, God, I posted this thing. Can I put a stamp on? And I did it, and it went, and they got it. And it was decoded. They never attacked any of the targets, so it was a complete waste of time and a complete waste of nervous energy. Anyway, that's the story of radical flank, my experience of a radical flank. I don't know how we're for time. We're going
to take 2 questions.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
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 Then let's go.
Okay, let's see how we go then. Okay, sure. Yes, sure.
As somebody who was part of the movement, do you think that the ANC started to nonviolent resistance, independence would have been won much earlier on in South Africa?
I do think so, but I mean, there's obviously no way of proving that. But I do think that, yes, I do. I think that the armed struggle was a diversion in many respects. It was a fantasy.
Okay. And it was a fantasy that detracted. It threw people like me off the track. Okay. Now there are people like Kasrils who weren't stupid like I was to do that, but. It threw me off the track. I thought that this was the way to go, and had it not been there, I think it might have been. And I was one of thousands, who were affected in that way, who saw it as some sort of method of actually bringing about change, where it was just nonsense. So I do think it would have been better. Yeah.
What has happened to the United Democratic Front? You know that the ANC is now the ruling political party. What has happened?
Well, the UDF doesn't exist anymore. It disbanded eventually a year or so after a couple. Well, was it a year or so? I think a year or so after the But I think it's a very important point to understand about the UDF is that the UDF never saw itself, and this is a real and serious position. This is not just this is not cosmetic. The UDF never saw itself as a rival to the ANC. In fact, the UDF became increasingly a semi-legal manifestation of the ANC inside South Africa. But as I say, in this uncertain relationship, but a semi-legal manifestation of the ANC. I think it's very important to realize that. So in many respects, the existence of this radical flank and a civil resistance movement operating in parallel was, in a certain sense, intra-party. It was almost part of the same, very much part of the same effort in some respects, except that there were some very narrow perspectives among some of the ANC leadership who continued to insist that the armed struggle was the way forward and should enjoy primacy in the liberation struggle. It's a difficult relationship properly to explain, but I think if you look upon it as being, as the UDF is eventually becoming a sort of an internal manifestation in a semi-legal sphere of the ANC, that would be probably the right way to look at it. So there was never, I mean, I know there were some people in the UDF, there was some talk among some people which were, and they were quickly shut up and isolated, of having an independent United Democratic Front which might emerge as some sort of rival to the ANC, but it never got anywhere. Now, I think, but there is another point to be made here, and that is this, that one of the points I think of matters of profound regret in South Africa is that after liberation, or when the ANC external leadership returned, many of the outstanding leaders who developed internally in the United Democratic Front were sidelined by the people from exile. I think the people from exile were used to infighting on a scale that people inside the country had been far too busy to ever get involved in. And they were quite easily outmaneuvered. The result is that people like Kasrils and others, I'm not attributing grievance to him, but there are several of the others that I know, outstanding people like a man called Popo Molefe, who was very important in the UDF. There were outstanding young leaders in the UDF who just got outmaneuvered. And that's a matter for real regret.
One final question.
Yes,
I would like to make an observation.
that many of the succinct points that you made could have been made about the PLO, and the time frame corresponds almost identically.
I think so. I would agree with you. I think the Palestinians have been very unlucky in who they've been led by. Very unlucky.
Well, and the extent of ideologization of armed struggle that was going on in that period was enormous, and there was no countervailing discourse.
Actually, can I take one from Zimbabwe? I think my comrade in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to say that what you obviously haven't covered in there is the effects of the South African armed struggle and repression in Zimbabwe and Zambia and Mozambique. I mean the
regional wars on that.
Yes, I mean, probably a lot of the terrorism was being repressed in other countries, not in South Africa itself, which I think is important to mention because this is a region very interconnected.
Yeah, the South African regime conducted proxy wars across the subcontinent in order to forestall and put pressure on states to prevent them giving the ANC more substantial measures of support for its armed struggle.
But then also the other issue is that South Africa were not able to capitalize from a more effective somehow armed struggle in Zimbabwe because of somehow tribal issues.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great, thank you.